Mike Flanagan has quickly become one of my favorite directors. Personally, starting out with The Haunting of Hill House on Netflix, all the way to The Life of Chuck, which is one of my most anticipated movies of the year, all of his projects have become appointment viewing for me. But one of these projects stands out amongst the rest, not only because of how great it is, but because of the history behind the project, and because it's an original Mike Flanagan project, and that's Midnight Mass. Over the years, Mike Flanagan has been the go-to guy when it comes to adapting anything Stephen King related. If you see a King adaptation that isn't directed by Mike Flanagan, then it's gonna be hit or miss, but most of the times miss. Don't get me wrong, Flanagan has done several of his own projects. There's Oculus and Hush, even his adaptations of Hill House, Bly Manor, and Fall of the House of Usher all have pretty unique spins on them, but Midnight Mass stands out as the project that is solely his, for many different reasons. You see, Flanagan had been working on Midnight Mass for most of his life, drafting the script as a movie, then a novel, then a series, but nobody really wanted to make it. So Midnight Mass started showing up in Flanagan's other works, almost foreshadowing its eventual release. In Gerald's Game, a movie based on a short story by, yep, you guessed it, Stephen King, you can see the title of the book on the shelf. Then in Hush, one of Flanagan's original movies, the main character is a deaf author who wrote, yep, you guessed it, Midnight Mass. Flanagan described Midnight Mass as the best project he'd never make, so he went on to making other stuff, and all of a sudden, everybody really wanted to make Midnight Mass. So Flanagan's dream project soon became a reality, releasing on Netflix in 2021, meeting pretty great reviews from both fans and critics, and then Flanagan moved on to other Stephen King adaptations. While Midnight Mass isn't his best known work, that probably belongs to Hill House, it almost seems like over the past few years, Midnight Mass has been forgotten. When people bring up Mike Flanagan, they talk about Hill House, Dr. Sleep, Stephen King, and look forward to his new Dark Tower series. Don't get me wrong, I'm very much looking forward to that too, but I think now is the time to go back over what I believe to be Mike Flanagan's masterpiece, and that's of course Midnight Mass. So in this video, I'm going to talk all the highs and lows of the show, a bit about its themes and characters, and of course, the sometimes overly long monologues. Full spoilers ahead for all episodes of Midnight Mass. Now let's travel to Crockett Island, head on into the church, and start thinking differently about how angels really look as we talk about Midnight Mass. So for those who have never seen Midnight Mass or just haven't seen it in a while, the story follows Riley Flynn returning back to his childhood home on Crockett Island after spending 4 years in prison due to a drunk driving accident. The very few residents of Crockett Island are very religious, though Riley himself struggles with his own faith because of the accident. Riley is very literally haunted by visions of the woman he killed, and he very much believes that he should have been the one that died, not the woman. While all of this is going on, the Monsignor of the island is supposed to be returning home from his pilgrimage. But a newer priest returns in his absence, citing Monsignor Pruitt's declining health. While the residents are skeptical of the new priest, Father Paul, at first, he starts to perform miracles in front of their eyes, miracles that come from a strange box that he brought with him to the island. Now, that's the overview without giving away too many spoilers, so if you haven't seen the show and that sounds interesting to you, then I suggest watching the series first and then coming back to the video. Riley is more or less our central character for a large part of the story, and it's cool to see Zach Gilford work with Mike Flanagan over his past few projects. I know him most as Matt Saracen from Friday Night Lights, but I've never really saw him in anything else besides some Purge movie, I think, and I used to think he was a solid but pretty one-dimensional actor, but seeing him in a lot of Flanagan's work has changed my mind on that, so it's just cool to see him in the Mike Flanagan Club. And speaking of the Mike Flanagan Club, every great director pulls from their same pool of actors. Scorsese uses DiCaprio, Nolan uses Cillian Murphy, Burton uses Johnny Depp, Tarantino, Samuel L. Jackson, and Flanagan uses Kate Siegel. who's also his wife, along with several others, but it's very easy to see why that is. One of the things I like about Flanagan's actors is how a lot of them are incredibly underrated. Michael Trucco has given some great performances when all I knew him as was one of Robin's love interests from How I Met Your Mother. Henry Thomas was all but forgotten after he played Elliot in E.T. Carla Gugino, I know, has been in other stuff, but I really only know her from Spy Kids. Now I think she's one of the greatest actresses on the planet. And if we're talking about performances in Midnight Mass specifically, then we have to talk about Hamish Linklater. Hamish Linklater as Father Paul is one of the most complex characters I've seen in a very long time. I think there's a bias against this show from the religious crowd because it does kinda definitely paint religion in a negative light, but Father Paul isn't really a villain. He does some not so great stuff, but he believes that he's right, which, yeah, most villains do and say, but you can actually see where he's coming from, which is what all great villains do. Okay, yeah, Father Paul is definitely a villain, but he's a very sympathetic villain for a great part of the story. And Hamish Linklater was an actor I wasn't familiar with. I still haven't seen him in too many things. He's not doing anything else with Flanagan, at least not right now. So maybe this will be his McConaughey in Interstellar for Nolan type of role. Extremely memorable, but they haven't worked together again. But hopefully I'm wrong and they'll work together again soon. But other than Riley and Father Paul, who do take up a great portion of screen time, there's plenty of other memorable characters. There's Sheriff Hassan, the guy who operates out of a closet in a convenience store. He doesn't really have much to do other than worry about Joe Colley getting too drunk, but he eventually gets his work cut out for him by the end of the season. There's the rest of the Flynn family, very devout Christians. While Mom seems to like having Riley back, Dad doesn't share the same enthusiasm. There's the town mayor, whose daughter was left paralyzed after a hunting incident involving Joe Colley, Aaron, the pregnant town teacher who has a history with Riley, and then there's Bev, one of the most infuriating but extremely well-written characters I've ever seen. All of these people, plus a few others, live on the small Crockett Island, where there seems to be more than a few mysteries to keep people occupied over the course of the season. Shit! So Midnight Mass is most definitely a horror and mystery-oriented show, but it does take a little while for the horror to actually come through to the surface. I'm not complaining about that at all because I don't need to be constantly jump scared in order to be entertained by a horror story. A lot of times the horror that works well is when everything builds up. The characters, the world, the story, and then hit me with the scary stuff, and it works so much better. Because of that, I feel like Mike Flanagan is the king of jump scares, especially in the past couple of years, and especially when it comes to the jump scares in his TV shows. Flanagan knows that it takes time to build the horror, and I believe that's why his stuff works so much better than most other horror directors. Across the first half of the season, the show is very much concerned with unsettling you through its visuals, through its few horrific and jump-scary moments on screen, all the way down to the makeup. And speaking of the makeup, the people in this town look off. Even in the pictures and photographs, everybody just seems to be very strange looking. This is, of course, due to the prosthetic makeup, how aged up a lot of the actors are, so that way they can eventually age down over the course of the story. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I'm not saying the makeup is bad. It's noticeable for sure, but I think it adds to the eerie nature of the story. Having a horror story centered on a small and isolated island is a very easy but very great location for a horror story. It's been done time and time again. Most recently, it's going to happen in 28 years later, but the one that comes to mind for me is Harper's Island. A wedding party goes to an island with a dark past, and that dark past, along with a killer in the wedding party, comes to the surface on the week of the wedding. I recently watched the show again. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of it or watched it, or if it's far too niche, but I have a whole script for a video about it, so if you have seen it or would want to watch me cover that show, please let me know that in the comments below. I'd love to see if anybody else has ever even heard of this show, because I don't think anybody else has. Alright, anyways, back to Midnight Mass. Crockett Island is small. Like, really small. 127 people to be exact. Some of this is shown to us through pretty typical establishing shots, while other stuff is pretty unique to the show. Like they don't have enough letters or numbers to fill out the church board correctly, the doctor's office is in somebody's home, and how the sheriff's station is inside of a convenience store. But sometimes this almost feels too small of an island. In a lot of the wide shots, I feel like maybe 127 people is too many people to live on this island. They talk about animals on the island, and we see all these cats, but where would they even go? What do they eat? How are they not just everywhere? This island is tiny. But other times, the show makes it apparent that this is still your average town. There's teenagers riding around on bikes and getting high, people going to church, the crock potluck. It's your pretty typical, extremely small town. But then when you see the amount of people in church and you're like, well, this is like 85% of the people that live on this island, it starts to seem too small to be even realistic. I feel like if there was 300 people that lived on this island and the island was maybe a bit bigger, everything would make a whole lot more sense. There's also a few questions raised pretty early on about how this island itself might be haunted. The teenagers talk about how there's many bodies buried beneath them, and on the very rainy nights, the bodies could even wash up on the shores of their houses. Then in the very next episode, the mayor talks about how a similar situation to the cats happened with a bunch of seagulls. Not to mention the oil spill and how that affected this island in particular. So is this island haunted? No, it's not. I believe all this stuff was said and placed in the story at the very beginning as a bit of misdirection as to where everything was headed. But good job, Mike Flanagan, you almost got me. In a lot of ways, the story of Midnight Mass is a very typical horror story that's been done a bunch of times before. But what separates Midnight Mass from a lot of these other stories is the structure of it. On paper, this is a story about a vampire that strolls into town, infects everybody, and wreaks havoc among the community. Sounds an awful lot like Salem's Lot, another Stephen King novel. But where Midnight Mass is different is how it relays this information to the audience. If in the first episode, Father Paul opened up this chest and we saw the winged creature and he started drinking its blood, then this series isn't as great as it is. It's the slow drip of information we get that makes the mystery greater and leaves the audience seeking more answers. Everybody in town slowly starts getting their health back. Mrs. Flynn doesn't need her glasses, Mr. Flynn's back doesn't hurt him anymore, Mildred's health makes a magnificent turn for the better, and of course, Lisa is able to walk again. This scene and Father Paul making Lisa stand is so uncomfortable. Even Beverly is like, okay, maybe that's enough, and when she looks like this, you know something is off. But this is such a great scene because at this point in the story, we don't know the cause of it, and it really does just seem like Father Paul is able to perform miracles. On the second watch, we know it's vampire blood, we know when she drank it and how other people are getting better, but like I said, that's why this story is so great. It's the steady stream of hints and clues that make this story stand out. It also becomes a show where a second watch is needed to catch all the things you missed the first time around. Mildred recognizing Father Paul to be Monsignor Pruitt before that reveal happens, Father Paul staring at Dr. Gunning at the crock potluck and her mentioning that it's the same look that Pruitt used to give her. As Mildred recovers from dementia and Sarah tests her memory, she even remembers to lie about who Sarah's father is. It's also very ironic how she calls him Father Paul, and that's actually her father. Then there's Riley's dreams eventually becoming reality, and Father Paul telling Riley he is dust, and to dust he shall return.
Remember you are dust, and to dust you shall return.
So now let's talk about the thing that this show is most criticized for, and that's the extra long monologues. Now to some degree, I can see why this is a heavy criticism, but other times when I think about these monologues, I don't think the show would be what it is if they weren't here. Not all shows could do this whatsoever, but I think that the dialogue and the performances within these shots are really captivating and interesting. So it doesn't bother me as much as it does other people. Mike Flanagan loves his long, unbroken tracking shots. And in this show specifically, a lot of these unbroken shots are really just characters talking and not a whole lot of stuff going on. unlike a lot of the long shots of Hill House, which were very intricately planned from the writing all the way to the actual set design. A lot of the Hill House tracking shots made you think, wow, how on earth did they achieve such a thing? Whereas a lot of the tracking shots in Midnight Mass don't actually feel all that necessary. Now, as the monologues go on, especially in the later half of the season, like when Riley or Aaron are talking about what happens when they die, things do steep into the pretentious territory. Like, nobody actually talks like this. It does take me out of the story a bit, but then there's moments like in episode 5 with Riley and Father Paul talking for like the entire episode, and I feel 100% captivated the entire time. Whereas, especially Erin's final monologue about what she thinks death is becomes so over the top and pretentious that it just kind of ruins the final episode for me.
And I am the lightning that jumps between. I am the energy firing the neurons, and I'm returning.
But speaking of Riley, let's talk about his very sudden and heartbreaking death at the end of episode 4. It came as a big shock to see the protagonist of the show die this early, so when Riley was just suddenly alive in episode 5, it made for a pretty great twist. Especially with him bringing Erin out to the boat, isolating her from everybody, knowing what he is, this isn't exactly the greatest of situations in terms of vampire lore. Riley and Father Paul's conversation once he's turned is very much the climax of Riley's story. This almost 40-minute sequence of Father Paul and Riley just talking about his transformation, God, life, death. If all of this wasn't as captivating as it is, there's so much that could go wrong here.
Today is critical for us, and I am finished. Complete honesty. How does it make you feel?
Jealous.
This whole sequence reads as some sort of strange inverse hero's journey situation. Riley's been chosen by this higher power for a great journey. He has a mentor, other allies who tell him how special he is, yet they also kind of resent him because of this. I mean, this is every hero's journey story in one. Harry Potter, Luke Skywalker, Hunger Games, Jon Snow, all of these people are special and chosen in some way, yet Riley rejects all of this. Father Paul talks about how he's gonna need to feed again, and whoever he feeds on, it'll just be God's will. And after everything Riley's been through, he refuses to murder another person, and goes on to meet death like an old friend. This episode ultimately leads us into thinking that Riley might have chosen Erin to feed off of, but he decides to just scar her for life instead by burning in front of her. He does this in order to prove to her everything he said was real, but because he loves her and wants what's best for her, and what's best for her is to leave. The other residents, including his own family, might be too far gone into believing Father Paul and his religious claims, but perhaps Erin isn't. And to have all of this relate to Riley's alcoholism is fantastic symbolism. It's very easy for him to just give in to the hunger, but he denies it and pushes through to the very end, even though those around him think he's just gone off the deep end. It's also the most horrific ending to any episode I've ever seen. Kate Siegel's screams live in my nightmares. Even just editing this portion of the video, I had to mute the sounds of this scene because I can't bear to listen to these screams. But the character that really steals the show is, like I said earlier, Hamish Linklater as Father Paul. Whether it be through his energetic sermons, his AA meetings with Riley, or his own point of view scenes where he struggles with the things he's doing to the people on this island. In episode 3, we get the revelation that Father Paul is actually Monsignor Pruitt, told through a series of flashbacks that also introduce the Angel, and a cheeky little nod to The Shining with the picture on the wall. But in the first 3 episodes, Father Paul seems determined to spread the message of God through the powers of the Angel, while also lying to all of those around him because they simply wouldn't understand these gifts until they were able to see them with their own eyes. In a lot of ways, in these first 3 episodes, Father Paul is the Renfield to the Angel's Dracula. But everything changes once Father Paul dies and comes back to life. He starts to become a bit weary over these gifts from God. He can't go out into the sun anymore. He has an uncontrollable hunger and thirst for blood until mistakes are made and there's truly no going back. He forgets about Sunday Mass and is instead stuck in the horror of the mistakes he's made. But it's Bev who convinces him that he's made no mistakes. All of this was just part of God's plan. Father Paul even admits this to Riley in their conversations during episode 5. So after he convinces Riley that he's been chosen by God, Father Paul goes through with his plan, only to realize he's made an enormous mistake. This couldn't be God's will. These actions are horrific, and by the end, he realizes this and gracefully accepts the end of his life. Like I said, Father Paul, or Monsignor Pruitt, is one of the greatest villains I've seen in a very long time. Both the character and the performance stick with you, and it's a big reason why I wanted to rewatch this show in the first place.
You don't carry a gun?
No need.
It's here where we enter the final act of the story. Keeping everyone on the island, messing with the boats, cutting the power, or taking down the cell tower, all the big hints that we're entering the final act in a horror story that takes place on an island. Now, there's been a few disturbing scenes in the show already, but the church on Easter night definitely takes the cake, even above Aaron's screams. Seeing everybody knowingly, or not so knowingly, offing themselves and forever changing their lives without even reading the terms and conditions because of a church is one of the most disturbing scenes I've seen in all of television. Riley's family is a bit skeptical over Father Paul announcing that he's actually Monsignor Pruitt. Aaron knows 100% that Riley was correct. Sarah and Mildred already weren't really on board with all of this. Lisa seems scared of the process, and Sheriff Hassan realizes something is truly wrong here. But everybody else seems 100% on board, and that's where the horror truly comes in. The reveal of the angel to everybody really makes everything seem so much more grim. The fact that people can see this and still listen to Monsignor Pruitt and drink rat poison is beyond me, but to be fair, this guy does give such great speeches that if I were there, I might have done the same. Everyone then turning on Sheriff Hassan and watching his own son drink the poison is such a dark scene. And once everybody wakes and we know who's human, we know just how urgent it is for all of them to get out. Everyone who does get out has to leave behind a loved one. The Flynns lose their husband/father, Sarah loses her mother, Lisa loses her parents, Hassan loses his son, and Aaron already lost Riley. Pruitt then realizes just how much he's fucked up after he wakes back up. He even admits his own faults and selfish reasons for bringing the angel back to Mildred. He talks about how their daughter, their child, wasn't a mistake, yet he never gave Aaron the chance to have a daughter. Even if he doesn't realize that, it all comes down to being his fault, and proves to both him and the audience that none of this could have actually been God's plan. Aaron lost her baby, and babies are known as God's gift. So to contrast Aaron's situation with Father Paul's own feelings on being a father and having a child, really puts all of this into perspective. The last episode goes full on 30 Days of Night after this, but unlike a lot of the other fun vampire horror movies, there's an air of tragedy around this whole event. It's not an enjoyable watch, but it is a great watch, if that makes sense. The stakes between the survivors are all very clearly spelled out. They have to leave, and they can't let anybody else leave, or else a whole lot of chaos starts in the rest of the world. This is shown to us through both sides burning things down. The vampires burning down the town at the instruction of Bev, and the humans burning down the boats so that way nobody can leave. An island of untrained vampires? Sounds like a job for Sam and Dean Winchester, if you ask me. Maybe perhaps a crossover for season 2? Or, the sun works too. Bev really does take the central villain role and the whole unlikable aspect to an extreme in this final episode. She's racist, she badmouths the dead, and there was truly one thing that I remembered about the show going back into it, and that was how much I hated this character. But for that reason, hats off to the actress. She's only been in bit roles in Flanagan shows, I believe, but I like that about all these shows. Each character and actor or actress eventually gets their chance to shine in a specific role or show. When Pruitt yells at Bev and says that all of this is wrong, she, of course, has some other Bible verse that fits the new mindset that she has. Apparently now priests and scribes are to blame for everything. There's just always a new line to justify the ends for Bev and for everybody else. Her death is so satisfying, and to see everybody else get their bittersweet ending, in this story it actually seems happy to see everybody fail and for the characters we do like to either survive or get what they needed to done and actually get their final happy moment. Now, I already talked about my issues with Erin's final monologue, but I just have to say it again. I genuinely don't like this monologue.
Printed on the tissue of my dying brain.
People don't talk like this. It just doesn't land for me whatsoever. It's incredibly pretentious, and it really takes me out of the last few minutes of the show. Also, we're shown all these vampires healing from all sorts of wounds, but the head vampire gets a few tiny slices in his wings and they don't just immediately heal. Not too sure about that aspect, but whatever. Of course, a huge part of this show has to do with religion, specifically how dangerous religion can be used as a tool to those that have faith. And the way that this is all brought together is through the use of vampires. Mike Flanagan himself was an altar boy, and at the age of 10 years old, he began thinking about how horrific the things going on at church really were. Eating the body of Christ, drinking his blood, and from those initial ideas, eventually came Midnight Mass. Now, a lot of people think that this is just a commentary on the Christian church, and while that is true, they talk about how Bev was embezzling money through the church and how there's a lot of dead towns across America, with brand new churches being built, with a lot of money and resources being allocated towards the church. But this show doesn't solely deal with Christianity. There's the character of Sheriff Hassan and his son Ali, who are Muslim. They talk about the differences between the religions, and that kind of opens the eyes of everybody around them to see maybe they aren't so different. Except for Bev. She doesn't want to hear any of it. Riley talks about how he went through all kinds of religious texts in prison, but came out an atheist anyways. So while there's definitely Christian overtones and how this story specifically gets out of control because of the people's belief in Father Paul, there's discussions about what happens after death, how the universe really works, and that's contrasted with talks of science over the course of the show, where the two overlap and how vastly different they can be. But there's another message within the layers of this story, and that's alcoholism. Mike Flanagan himself talked about how he was glad he wasn't given the chance to shoot this back in 2014 when he wanted to, because he wasn't sober at that point, so he didn't think he could do the themes of this story justice. And throughout the final few episodes, I think there's far more themes about alcoholism than there is about religion. There's the scene where Erin, Sarah, and Mildred are talking about what could be happening on the island, and Sarah suggests that it's something in the same family of a rare blood disorder. She then talks about how much poison is in people's bodies and how people can get over it, but she specifically mentions the effects of alcohol and how much of a poison that is.
I think when we ingest poison, alcohol, whatever, before a certain point, if we stop taking it in, maybe our body can push it back out, filter it out the way it does any other harmful substance if it's not too much.
Then in the final episode, when the Flynns are turned into vampires, they talk about how they thought the hunger would be uncontrollable, but it's not, and they can fight it off themselves, something that Riley was also able to do right up to the very end. Sure, there's a ton of themes about religion, and that was a very personal topic to Mike Flanagan, but so was alcoholism, and I think that comes through more in the end than anything else. I also like how the church gets progressively more full as the miracles start happening over the course of the season. It kind of proves how society in general cares more for their own self-interests than anything else. These people all want miracles for themselves now that a miracle happened for somebody else. Maybe if there was more stuff like this in the church, then more people would go. But then again, what would be behind all this stuff if that got more people to attend? Speaking of which, why does nobody ever think of vampires? Even in the first episode, with all the cats drained of blood, my first thought, whether it would be ironic or not, would be, this sounds like a vampire. A lot of these kinds of stories operate under the assumption that the characters aren't aware of what monsters actually are. So I suppose in this world, vampires aren't a story or anything like that. It's like how in The Walking Dead, they never say zombie, because I guess zombies don't exist. I'm not sure if it's better to address it or not address it. There's just always the suspension of disbelief you have to have with you when you watch these kinds of shows. But maybe that's an additional layer on the religious aspect of the show. The ability to look past the obvious because of what you want it to be, because what your faith says it could be, because it's easier to continue having faith than the cruel reality of what's right in front of you. Anyways, I love myself a good vampire story, a story that takes a very typical monster, adds some unique elements while honoring the rules of the established creature's lore, and makes it scary again. Vampire lore in Midnight Mass is pretty similar in a lot of ways. Drink the blood of a vampire, die and then become one, you burn in the sun, all the typical vampire stuff, but there's also a lot of other unique vampire traits. How the vampires see light is especially cool. I'm not sure if this is something to do with the themes or lore or if it just looks cool, but either way, nice addition. The vampire being able to mimic somebody else is definitely new. And considering this happens once and never again, it makes you wonder what other powers this vampire has that we don't see. I personally like that the mysteries behind this vampire aren't all that explained. It makes it much scarier. We don't really know what this thing's goal is or why it was going along with Father Paul. Did it want to take over the world and he saw Father Paul as an opportunity to do that? Not sure, but it makes this whole creature far more mysterious and far more horrific. So yeah, those are all my thoughts on Midnight Mass. I hadn't watched this show since it first came out in 2021. I remember back on it incredibly fondly, and I do think for so many reasons that this project truly is Mike Flanagan's masterpiece. So I'm going to give Midnight Mass a 9.2 out of 10. What are your thoughts on Midnight Mass? What's your favorite Mike Flanagan project? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, want to see more videos like this, like, say, a video about The Haunting of Hill House, let me know that by hitting the like button. If this video can get to 4,000 likes in the first week of release, then I'll have a video on Hill House coming out for you all shortly. Thanks for watching, thanks to channel members, and I'll see you all in the next one.